Have you ever wondered how a young man from a small kingdom in northern Greece managed to conquer the largest empire the world had ever seen? And more than that, how did his army, outnumbered, exhausted, and thousands of miles from home, crush every force that dared to stand against it? This isn't just the story of Alexander the Great, it's the story of an unstoppable machine built on genius, discipline, and an almost supernatural belief in victory. From the plains of Issus to the burning heart of Persia, Alexander's army didn't just fight battles, it rewrote the rules of warfare. But beneath the legend lies something far deeper, a hidden system of tactics, training, and leadership that turned ordinary men into living weapons. As we peel back history's layers, you'll see the truth behind the myth, the secret strengths that made Alexander's army not only unbeatable, but unforgettable. So stay till the end, because this isn't just ancient history, it's a masterclass in human ambition, loyalty, and strategy. If you love epic battles, brilliant minds, and the raw power of history unfolding, hit that subscribe button and let's march with Alexander into the heart of conquest itself. The birth of a conqueror. What if the world's greatest empire was forged not by chance, but by a boy who was trained to believe he was destined for the impossible? And what if that belief, burning brighter than any sword, was the true weapon that made his army unstoppable? Long before Alexander was called the Great, he was a restless shadow pacing the marble halls of Pella, the Macedonian capital. The scent of olive oil lamps mixed with the clang of swords from the training yard. Outside, his father, King Philip II, was shaping an army that would soon terrify Greece. Inside, a 13-year-old Alexander sat before a man who spoke not of war, but of stars and destiny. Aristotle. It was here, between the philosopher's wisdom and the general's steel, that Alexander's vision was forged. Aristotle taught him logic, ethics, and the tales of Achilles, the warrior who sought eternal glory. Philip taught him the price of ambition, the cunning of politics, and the necessity of power. Between them, they built a mind that could see both the poetry and the brutality of conquest. Alexander was told he was descended from gods, but he didn't just want to believe it, he wanted to prove it. When Philip reformed the Macedonian army, it was more than a military upgrade. It was the creation of a new organism, disciplined, flexible, terrifyingly precise. The Phalanx, that wall of long spears, called sarissas, moved like a single heartbeat, each man trained to hold formation, even when chaos screamed around them. Philip's reforms were revolutionary, but Alexander would elevate them to legend at 16. When most princes still struggled with tutors, Alexander commanded his first battle. Philip was away on campaign when a Thracian tribe revolted. Rather than wait, Alexander led the counterattack himself. He didn't just win, he crushed them, founding a city called Alexandropolis on their ruins. That victory lit something inside him. The boy who once listened to philosophers now heard the music of conquest. But destiny rarely arrives quietly. One night during a grand feast, Alexander watched his father drunk, triumphant, and brutal humiliate his mother, Olympias. The court erupted in chaos. Words became daggers. Philip lunged at his son, sword half drawn, and fell flat on the floor, his own drink spilling over him. Alexander's voice cut through the silence. Here is the man preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, and he cannot even cross from one table to another. The rift between father and son was sealed, and not long after, Philip II was assassinated, stabbed at his own daughter's wedding. Whispers filled the palace. Some blamed Persia, some blamed Olympias, some, even Alexander, but no one dared confront him. At just 20, Alexander ascended to the throne of Macedonia kingdom, surrounded by enemies. Greece celebrated his father's death with revolts, Persia prepared to invade, and his own nobles doubted him. Yet within 2 years, the boy silenced them all. He stormed Thebes, crushed the rebellion, and burned the city to the ground, leaving only the house of the poet Pindar untouched. It was a message to the world: defy him, and history would erase you. But beneath the ruthlessness was precision. Alexander didn't simply destroy, he restructured. He reassembled his father's army, handpicking veterans, training new recruits in endless drills until the phalanx and cavalry moved as if controlled by one mind. He personally fought alongside them, ate their rations, shared their water, and called them companions. To them, he was not just a king, he was one of them. And then came the dream that would change the world. Standing at the edge of the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe and Asia, Alexander gazed across to the distant shore. Somewhere beyond those waters lay the Persian Empire behemoth that stretched from Egypt to India. Alexander took a handful of dust from the ground, threw it into the air, and whispered, "From this land, we take the world." But this wasn't madness. This was method. Behind every move was strategy. His army, some 35,000 men, was small compared to Persia's millions. But it was designed for motion, precision, and shock. The phalanx would pin the enemy. The cavalry, led by Alexander himself, would strike like lightning at their weakest point. Every soldier was trained not just to fight, but to think. Still, the road ahead was shadowed by uncertainty. The Persian army was vast, their wealth unmatched, their generals seasoned. But Alexander knew something his enemies didn't. Wars aren't only won by numbers, they're won by spirit. As his fleet set sail, thunder rolled over the sea. The soldiers watched their young king standing at the bow, his cloak whipping in the wind, eyes locked on Asia's distant coast. He had told them stories of Achilles and Troy, and now he was living one. They believed in him not because of his crown, but because he made them feel they were part of something eternal. When they reached the shores of Asia Minor, Alexander performed an ancient ritual. He threw a spear into the sand and declared it conquered land. Then, in a moment that would define his legend, he ordered the ships behind them to burn. The men stared in disbelief. Alexander turned and said, "Now there is no going back. We will return home only as victors." The flames licked the sky as his soldiers realized the truth. They were bound to their king not by orders, but by fate. Behind them was fire. Before them, the empire of Persia. Between them, a young man who dared to dream he was greater than death itself. As night fell, Alexander looked toward the horizon, where the stars shimmered above a world yet to be conquered. He whispered to himself, perhaps remembering Aristotle's words, "To seek greatness is to stand alone, but far away." In the royal courts of Persia, another man, King Darius III, was already hearing rumors of the young Macedonian lion marching toward his borders. And soon, these two worlds would collide in a clash so monumental that history itself would tremble. The winds of destiny had begun to stir, and Alexander's unstoppable army was about to meet the empire that believed. No one could challenge it. The question wasn't whether Alexander would win, but what he would become in the process. And that answer lay waiting beyond the horizon. Fire and strategy. The first clash with Persia. Have you ever seen a storm before it breaks when the wind goes quiet? The sky holds its breath, and you just know something unstoppable is about to begin. That's how it felt when Alexander's army first set foot in Asia. The silence before the roar of conquest. The Persian Empire stretched across continents, a realm of gold, marble, and fear. Darius III ruled from his glittering throne in Persepolis, confident that no army could ever threaten him. His satraps, Persian governors, commanded tens of thousands of men, each guarding their corner of the empire like wolves. To them, Alexander was just a reckless boy with dreams too big for his sword. They would soon learn how wrong they were. Alexander's campaign began not with brute force, but with psychological precision. He knew that before you can conquer land, you must conquer perception. He sent envoys to Greek cities under Persian rule, promising freedom instead of slavery, glory instead of gold. In one move, he turned Persia's subjects into his potential allies. Every victory, even before the first battle, was fought in mines as much as on fields. Then came the first tester battle of the Granicus River. The Persian satraps had gathered their cavalry on the opposite bank, their spears gleaming beneath the sun. The river between them was swift and cold, its current a deadly barrier. Alexander's generals urged caution. Crossing under fire was madness. But Alexander was not built for waiting. He rode to the front lines, his white-plumed helmet catching the morning light. "They think the river will stop us," he said, smiling faintly. "Let's show them the Macedonian way." And with that, he spurred his horse into the torrent. The water churned around him as arrows hissed through the air. His soldiers followed, their shields rising like a moving wall. The Persians unleashed chaos, but Alexander's formation didn't break. Emerging from the current, drenched and breathless, he led a direct charge into the enemy ranks. The clash was thunder, bronze against iron, hooves against flesh. Alexander's spear struck a Persian noble clean from his saddle. His companions followed, driving deep into the Persian lines. But then a scimitar flashed a blow meant for his head. Alexander's helmet split, blood trickling down his cheek. For a heartbeat, the young king was vulnerable. A Persian warrior raised his blade for the killing strike butt before it fell. Cletus, the Black Alexander's loyal officer, cut the man down, saving his king's life. The battle raged, but the tide had turned. The Persians, broken and leaderless, fled the field. That day, the legend of invincibility was born. Word spread across Asia that the boy king had crossed an impossible river, fought at the front, and emerged alive. The symbolism was not lost. He had crossed from Europe into Asia, from prince into myth. Yet Alexander didn't celebrate. As his soldiers looted the Persian camp, he walked among the dead, silent. He ordered that Greek mercenaries who had fought for Persia be executed as traitors. To his men, it was justice. To his enemies, it was a warning there was no neutral ground in Alexander's war. But conquest was not just about blood. It was about hearts and minds. As he moved through Asia Minor, Alexander spared cities that surrendered and rebuilt temples destroyed by the Persians. He was not here to destroy civilization, he was here to claim it. His charisma turned former enemies into followers. Even captured nobles knelt not in fear, but in awe. One night, as they camped near the ruins of Troy, Alexander walked alone beneath the stars. He stood before the ancient tombs of Achilles and Patroclus, his childhood heroes. Kneeling, he placed a wreath on Achilles' grave and whispered, "You had Homer to sing your glory. I shall have history, but destiny doesn't come without price." As the army advanced eastward, the Persian forces gathered in the shadows. Darius III, enraged by the loss at Granicus, prepared a massive counterstrike. He summoned his satraps, his cavalry, his mercenaries. "This boy has trespassed into Persia," Darius declared, "and he will be crushed beneath Persian earth." Yet even as Darius planned his revenge, Alexander's intelligence networks, scouts, even defectors fed him every detail. He knew where Darius's forces were gathering, how they planned to strike. His genius was not in reaction, but anticipation at the ancient city of Gordium. Alexander faced a different kind of battle, the Gordian knot. According to legend, whoever untied the knot would rule all of Asia. The rope was impossibly tangled, tied to the yoke of an ancient chariot. Onlookers waited as Alexander studied it in silence. Then, without warning, he drew his sword and sliced through it in a single stroke. "It makes no difference how the knot is undone," he said. That moment was more than symbolic, it was prophecy fulfilled. His soldiers cheered, believing fate itself had bowed before their king. But Alexander's expression remained distant, thoughtful. Even he sensed something shifting, an invisible weight of destiny pressing harder, soon. His scouts brought word. Darius was moving west, with an army set to number in the hundreds of thousands. The clash would dwarf anything the world had seen. Alexander's commanders urged retreat, but he refused. "We didn't cross the Hellespont to go back," he told them. "We go forward to the heart of Persia." The two forces met near a place called Issus, a narrow plain trapped between mountains and sea. The terrain nullified Darius's advantage, in numbers an accidental gift to Alexander's strategy. When the Persians saw the Macedonian banners, their king laughed. "A child comes to fight a god," Darius said. But that night, as torches flickered across the Macedonian camp, Alexander stood before his men. "Tomorrow," he said, "we face the greatest army in the world. But remember, numbers don't win battles. Men do. And every one of you is worth 100 of theirs." The dawn rose red over Issus. The ground trembled with Persian chariots, the air thick with arrows. Darius's army stretched beyond sight. Yet Alexander's formation held, the phalanx advancing like a living wall. Then, at the perfect moment, Alexander led his cavalry in a sweeping arc toward the Persian. Center straight for Darius himself, the charge shattered the line. Persian soldiers scattered like leaves before a storm. Darius, watching his army crumble, turned his chariot and fled, leaving behind his family, his treasures, his pride. It was the moment that broke Persia's illusion of invincibility. Alexander had done the unthinkable. He had defeated the great king on his own soil. The spoils were unimaginable: gold, jewels, and even Darius's wife and children, whom Alexander treated with respect, refusing to claim them as his own. "Tell your king," he said, "that I fight for empires, not vengeance." But amid the triumph, a shadow lingered. Darius was still alive, and an empire doesn't fall until its heart stops beating. Alexander knew this was only the beginning. As his soldiers feasted and sang, he looked east, where the deserts of Mesopotamia shimmered like a mirage. Beyond that horizon, the greatest battle of his life awaited, the one that would decide not only who ruled the world, but what kind of man he would become. And so, as the fires of victory burned through the night, Alexander whispered to his generals, "Tomorrow, we march deeper into the empire of the gods." The storm had only begun. The fall of kings. Alexander versus Darius. What happens when two worlds collide, one driven by destiny, the other by desperation? when the will of a single man threatens to break the spine of an empire that has stood for centuries? The answer begins with dust, fire, and a name shouted across endless plains: Darius. After Issus, Alexander was no longer just a Macedonian king. He was the conqueror of the West. Yet for him, victory was never enough. Darius's flight had left a wounded challenge unfulfilled. The Persian king still ruled the heart of Asia, and Alexander's vision was incomplete. His men spoke of home, of families left behind, but Alexander's eyes remained fixed eastward. "We can rest," he told them, "when there is no one left to challenge us." Marching through Syria and Phoenicia, he found cities trembling before him. Some opened their gates willingly, others resisted and paid the price. But the coastal fortress of Tyre stood defiant. It was said to be unconquerable, built on an island with walls 100 feet high, surrounded by deep waters. Darius's envoys had offered gold and alliance if Alexander would turn back. But Alexander didn't take bribes. He took legacies. Tyre became his obsession. Unable to reach it by land, he ordered his engineers to build a causeway stone by stone, stretching from the mainland into the sea. The work was grueling. The Tyrians rained fire and arrows from their towers, burning siege engines and men alike. Weeks turned into months. Many in the army whispered that their king had gone mad. But Alexander's madness was method. "There is no wall the will of man cannot climb," he told them. When the causeway finally reached the island, he unleashed a storm unlike any seen before. His siege towers rolled forward, their catapults thundering. The sea burned with floating oil fires as Macedonian ships rammed the city's harbor. Alexander himself led the final assault, scaling the walls amid flying spears. When Tyre fell, he ordered the defenders' banners torn down and raised his own, the sunburst of Macedon, above the ruins. The city that once believed itself untouchable was gone, and the message was clear: even the sea could not protect those who defied him. Darius watched these reports from his golden throne in Babylon, fury boiling beneath his calm mask. He sent another letter to Alexander, this time offering peace. "You may take all lands west of the Euphrates," it read, "and I will give you my daughter's hand in marriage. Let us share the world rather than destroy it." Alexander's generals urged him to accept. It was enough land, enough power, but Alexander's eyes burned with something deeper than ambition. "If I were Darius," he said, "I would accept peace. But since I am Alexander, I must take the world." He tore the letter in half. Then came Egypt, a land weary of Persian rule. When Alexander entered, the people hailed him not as a conqueror but as a liberator. He restored temples, honored their gods, and founded a city that would bear his name forever: Alexandria. It was to be the crossroads of the world, where Greek thought and Eastern wisdom would meet. In the desert beyond, he visited the oracle of Siwa. Legends said only true sons of gods could enter its inner sanctum. When Alexander emerged, he was pale, shaken, but triumphant. He never revealed what the priest had told him, but rumors spread that he had been called the son of Zeus Ammon himself. From that moment, his conviction hardened. He was no longer merely human in his own mind. He was chosen, but destiny, as always, waits with teeth hidden. Darius was not idle. In the heart of Mesopotamia, near a place called Gaugamela, he gathered his last and greatest army. The numbers defied comprehension, perhaps 200,000 men. Chariots fitted with blades, elephants brought from India. The plain was wide open, perfect for Persian cavalry to encircle their enemy. Darius believed he had learned from Issus. This time, there would be no escape. Alexander marched toward the storm with only 40,000 men. His scouts brought reports of the Persian host, but he didn't flinch. The night before the battle, his men lay sleepless, whispering prayers. Alexander, by contrast, slept soundly under the stars. When his general Parmenion asked how he could rest with the fate of the world at hand, Alexander smiled. "How could I not? We've already won. I've seen it." Dawn spilled across the plains of Gaugamela. The Persians stretched to the horizon, banners fluttering like waves. Darius, high on his chariot, gleamed like a living sun. The Macedonian line looked small, fragile, impossibly outnumbered. And yet there was movement, rhythm, something almost supernatural in their precision. As the battle began, the Persian chariots thundered forward, blades spinning to tear through men and horses alike. But Alexander had anticipated this. His men opened their ranks, allowing the chariots to pass harmlessly through before striking them from behind. The phalanx advanced, pikes lowering like a forest of death. Then came the moment of brilliance. Alexander noticed a gap forming in the Persian left flanker, weakness born from their attempt to outflank him. With a swift order, he turned his cavalry and charged straight through it, a diagonal spear through the heart of the enemy. Dust exploded around him as the companions tore into the Persian center. He saw Darius ahead, the great king's chariot turning wildly in the chaos. For a heartbeat, their eyes met to rulers, to destinies colliding. And then, once more, Darius fled. The symbol of Persia's power broke before the will of one man. When the dust settled, the plain was silent. The Persian army had shattered, their empire trembling. Alexander stood upon the field, blood drying on his armor, his horse breathing raggedly beneath him. He had done it. He was now the King of Kings, master of Asia. But victory has its ghosts. As his men celebrated, Alexander gazed at the horizon, where Darius had vanished. He did not smile. "He is still alive," he murmured, "and so the war continues." Weeks later, as they pursued the fleeing king across the vast Persian lands, a messenger brought grim news. Darius had been murdered by his own satrap, Bessus, in an attempt to curry favor with Alexander. They found the great king dying in a wagon on a desolate road. When Alexander approached, Darius's final words, weak and trembling, were said to have been of thanks that his conqueror was not a barbarian. Alexander covered the fallen king with his cloak and wept. "He was brave," he said quietly, "and there will never be another like him." Then he swore vengeance not against his enemy, but against those who had betrayed him. Bessus was hunted down and executed, his body displayed as a warning dot at last. Persia was his. The palaces of Persepolis opened their golden doors to him. The halls shimmered with wealth beyond imagination. As his soldiers feasted, Alexander walked alone through the throne room, his torch flickering against the carved reliefs of ancient kings. Then, in a moment of fiery symbolism, he set the palace ablaze. Flames devoured the empire of Darius, smoke curling into the night like the ghost of history itself. But, as the walls fell, so did something in Alexander's heart. He had conquered everything he had ever dreamed of, yet standing in the ashes, he realized he was still not satisfied. Beyond Persia lay more lands India, the edge of the known world, and somewhere inside him, a whisper said, "You are not done." The boy who once sought glory now chased immortality, and on the far side of the mountains, where elephants roamed and rivers glowed like molten silver. New enemies, weighted ones, unlike any he had ever faced before. The legend was about to meet its greatest test. Into the unknown, the march to India. Have you ever reached a point where victory feels less like triumph and more like hunger, a fire that can't be put out, no matter how much it consumes? That's where Alexander stood after Persia burned. He had everything: an empire, a crown, the adoration of armies, but inside him, the same question that once drove him to the Hellespont whispered again, what lies beyond? The Persian Empire was broken. Babylon, Susa, Persepolis bent their knees. Yet Alexander couldn't stop. He began to adopt Persian customs, wearing their robes, greeting nobles in their fashion. To his Macedonian officers, this was unsettling. They saw their king changing, becoming something ... other. The line between conqueror and god began to blur. Still, Alexander pressed eastward. His dream had expanded. He wanted not just to rule Asia, but to fuse it. Greek and Persian, east and west, united under one vision. He married Roxana, a noblewoman from Bactria, stunning his generals. It is not enough to conquer a people, he told them. You must make them yours. But the road to India was no simple march. It was a descent into chaos, mountains and myth. The Hindu Kush stood like a wall of stone, its peaks buried in snow, its valleys haunted by the ghosts of failed invasions. The passes were narrow, the air thin, and the men exhausted. Frostbitten soldiers whispered that the gods themselves guarded the path. Alexander led from the front, sharing their hardship, climbing icy ridges, personally pulling horses from the ravines. He didn't just command his army, he suffered with them. His legend was no longer born from victory alone, but from endurance. In Bactria, he faced resistance unlike any before. Guerrilla fighters melted into the mountains, striking from the shadows. It wasn't a war of open battles, it was a war of ghosts. But Alexander adapted. He divided his forces into smaller units, learned to fight the way his enemies did. Each victory was slower, bloodier, but inevitable. The unstoppable army proved it was more than a hammer, it was a mind. Then came Spitamenes, the rebel who dared defy him. Charismatic, cunning, always one step ahead, Spitamenes turned the sands of Sogdiana into a trap. His raids devastated Alexander's supply lines. Whole garrisons vanished into the desert. For the first time, Alexander's men began to doubt him. But Alexander refused to retreat. He hunted Spitamenes with relentless fury, outmaneuvering him until even his own allies turned on him. When Spitamenes was finally captured, his severed head was brought to Alexander. The king looked at it in silence, then whispered, "Even the cleverest fox cannot escape forever." After 3 years of endless fighting, Alexander's army reached the Indus River, the edge of the known world. The air was thick, humid, unlike anything they'd known. Monsoon clouds rolled above them like bruises. The men gazed across the river and saw an alien land, vast plains, elephants, strange temples, and kings whose faces were painted like gods. It was there that Alexander met King Porus of the Punjab, a ruler as proud as himself. When Alexander demanded submission, Porus replied, "I will meet you in battle." On equal ground, it was the first time someone had spoken to him as an equal since Darius. The Battle of the Hydaspes would test everything Alexander had built: his tactics, his endurance, his will. Porus's army was massive, his war elephants towering like living fortresses. The river between them raged with monsoon floods. Alexander studied it for days, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then, one stormy night, he led part of his army at Priva in silence, crossing under lightning and rain at dawn. Porus was stunned to find the Macedonians attacking from the flank. The battlefield turned into chaos. The elephants charged, trumpeting like thunder gods. Alexander's horses panicked. The ground trembled. Men were crushed beneath massive feet. Yet amidst the panic, Alexander found rhythm. He directed his phalanx to open their ranks, letting the elephants pass before striking their vulnerable sides. Javelins pierced the beasts, arrows rained down, and the Macedonians closed in from all directions. Porus, mounted on a giant elephant, refused to retreat. Even when wounded, he fought on, his soldiers rallying round him. Alexander, watching from across the field, felt admiration more than hatred. When Porus was finally captured, bleeding but unbowed, Alexander approached him and asked, "How would you like me to treat you?" Porus, exhausted yet defiant, replied, "Like a king." Alexander smiled. "So be it." Instead of executing him, Alexander restored Porus to his throne, even granting him more territory. To his general's disbelief, the conqueror had turned an enemy into an ally. It was a gesture that echoed far beyond the battlefield, a show of respect for courage, a statement that conquest could be more than destruction. But victory came with a cost. The Hydaspes had broken something in Alexander's army. The men had followed him for over 8 years, Sox deserts, mountains, rivers, and nightmares. They had given him everything. But now, standing on the banks of the Hyphaesus River, they refused to go farther. The jungles beyond, they were told, teemed with even greater armies and beasts. The men had seen enough death, enough glory. When Alexander ordered them to march east, the camp went silent. No one moved. For the first time, his command met silence. He raged, pleaded, and reasoned. "Beyond that river," he said, "lies the edge of the world. Don't you want to see it? Don't you want your names written beside the gods?" But they looked at him not as a god, but as a man who had forgotten he was one. That night, Alexander sat alone by the river. Rain fell softly, and the torches flickered. He realized that even a conqueror cannot conquer the hearts of men forever. At dawn, he walked to his army, stood before them, and said quietly, "We will go home." The cheer that rose from the ranks was both relief and heartbreak. The god had spoken as a man again. But even in retreat, Alexander refused to take the easy path. He led his army south through the Gedrosian desert, a wasteland of blistering sand and death. Many perished. The sun devoured their shadows. Yet Alexander marched on foot beside them, sharing every agony. His men followed, not because they feared him, but because they still believed. When they finally reached civilization again, their ranks were half empty. But those who survived had witnessed the impossible journey that stretched beyond the human spirit. Alexander had reached the edge of the world, and in doing so, had touched the edge of himself. But as they returned to Babylon, whispers began to follow him like ghosts. His closest friends were dead or fading. His generals eyed him with unease. And inside his heart, something dark was growing, a restlessness that victory could no longer satisfy. He had conquered the world. But what happens to a man when there's nothing left to conquer? The answer was waiting for Jim in Babylon. The price of glory, the fall of a god. What happens when a man who has conquered the world begins to lose the one thing he cannot fight? Time. The soldiers called him divine. The poets sang of him as immortal. Yet Alexander, returning to Babylon, carried something far heavier than gold, the weight of every victory, every life taken in his name, every ghost that followed him home. The city glittered like a jewel on the Euphrates, its hanging gardens shimmering in the heat, its palaces overflowing with tribute from every corner of the known world. But behind the glory, a quiet unease coiled like smoke. The king, who once united men through vision, now found himself surrounded by whispers, suspicion, and shadows. He had become unpredictable, part visionary, part tyrant. His body bore scars from countless battles, but his mind carried the deeper wounds. He began to drink more, to hold endless feasts that blurred the line between celebration and madness. Around him, the men who had once called him brother now called him lord. The tension snapped one fateful night. In the middle of a drunken celebration, Cletus, the Black, the same man who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus, to speak what others would not. "We fought for you as a man," he shouted, "not a god." The room froze. Alexander's eyes, glazed with wine and fury, darkened. Cletus had struck the unspoken truth. Alexander had crossed a line even his closest friends couldn't follow. Words became shouts, shouts became curses. Then, in a sudden storm of rage, Alexander seized a spear and drove it through Cletus's chest. Silence fell. The man who had once pulled him from death now lay dead at his feet. Moments later, clarity returned like a knife to his heart. Alexander dropped the weapon, fell to his knees, and wept uncontrollably. For 3 days he locked himself away, refusing food or sleep, consumed by guilt. "Have I become the very monster I sought to destroy?" he whispered. It was the first time the unstoppable conqueror had been conquered, from within. But the world would not wait for his grief. Babylon became his new capital, a fusion of Greek ambition and Eastern splendor. He married more Persian nobles to bind loyalty, trained Asian soldiers in Macedonian tactics, and dreamed of an empire where all men were equal under his rule. He even ordered his soldiers to take local wives, a decree that enraged the veterans who saw themselves as foreigners in a land they didn't understand. The unity Alexander imagined was beautiful, but it was fragile, built on the edge of exhaustion. The old guard resented the new customs. The new recruits resented being ruled by foreigners. In trying to make one world, Alexander had unknowingly created two hearts beating out of rhythm, and yet his ambition refused to rest. He planned new campaigns Arabia, perhaps even beyond the seas, places where no map dared to reach. His engineers began building ships along the Euphrates, his scribes recording orders for exploration. But as his empire stretched, so did the distance between him and those who had once followed him blindly. Then came a night that seemed almost prophetic. A sudden storm swept across Babylon, lightning splitting the sky above the city's walls. That same night, an omen spread among the soldiers. A lion had escaped from the royal menagerie and had been slain by one of Alexander's guards. The priests whispered that the king of beasts had fallen, and so might the king of men. A few days later, during a lavish banquet, Alexander drank deeply, laughing louder than usual, his eyes fever bright. He spoke of the sea beyond Arabia, of worlds unseen. Then, as the night waned, he clutched his side in pain. His voice broke mid-sentence. He was helped to his chamber, sweat pouring down his face, his breath shallow and uneven dot. At first, everyone thought it was exhaustion or fever. He had survived worse, but as days passed, his condition worsened. His voice faded to a whisper. His generals stood helpless by his bedside, each wondering what his death would mean for the empire they had bled for. Even as his body failed, his mind remained sharp. When they asked who should rule after him, he smiled faintly and said, to the strongest, it was both a prophecy and a curse. Those words would plunge his empire into chaos the moment he drew his last breath. In his final hours, Alexander could barely speak. He was carried to the riverbank, where he watched the sun set over Babylon, the same sun that had once risen over Macedon when he was a boy dreaming of glory. He asked to be left alone with his thoughts, perhaps remembering the faces of those who had fallen beside him, the cities he had built, the gods he had defied. When he finally closed his eyes, the world seemed to stop. The conqueror who had crossed continents, who had redrawn the map of civilization, was gone at only 32 years old. His empire, vast and shimmering, stretched from Greece to India, but it had no center without him. News of his death spread like fire. Soldiers wept, cities rioted, generals schemed. Some refused to believe he was truly gone, claiming he had ascended to the gods. But for those who had marched with him through deserts and storms, the silence that followed was unbearable. They remembered how he had once said, I would rather live a short life of glory than a long one of obscurity. He had kept that promise, but at what cost? His body was placed in a golden sarcophagus and taken toward Macedon, but never reached it. Egypt claimed him, and there, in the city that bore his name, Alexandria, his tomb became legend. Some say his spirit still lingers, wandering the halls of time, restless, searching for another horizon to cross. And yet, the story of Alexander the Great isn't merely one of conquest or empire. It's the story of what it means to be human, of how even the greatest among us cannot escape the pull of mortality. His armies were unstoppable, his strategies unmatched. But in the end, the one battle he could not win was against himself. Still, as centuries passed, his name refused to fade. His tactics were studied, his courage immortalized, his dream of unity echoed by empires that followed. From Caesar to Napoleon, every conqueror who gazed eastward saw his shadow. But somewhere in that vast shadow lies a question that still burns. If Alexander had lived longer, would he have built a lasting peace or destroyed everything he had created? No one will ever know. Yet one truth remains unshaken. No army, before or since, has ever marched with such purpose, such belief, or such fire, and as the echoes of his footsteps fade into legend, we are left with the haunting reminder that greatness always comes with a price. The boy who became a god had reached for eternity, and found it, not in heaven, but in history. Legacy of the unstoppable. What Alexander left behind, what remains when a man who sought eternity is gone. When the fire that lit 1,000 conquests finally flickers out, what does it leave behind? Ashes, or embers that refuse to die? The story of Alexander the Great doesn't end with his death. In truth, that's when his legend began to grow larger than life. When the news of his passing reached the corners of his empire, the world seemed to fracture. His generals, those same men who had once bled beside him, now turned on each other like wolves fighting over the carcass of a god. The empire he had built, stretching from the Aegean to the Indus, had no heir strong enough to hold it. His son, unborn at the time of his death, would never rule. His dream of one world, united under his vision, splintered into chaos. They called them the Diadochi, the successors. Ptolemy took Egypt and claimed Alexander's body, entombing it in Alexandria, where pilgrims from across the world would one day come to weep. Seleucus carved his empire across Persia and Mesopotamia. Antigonus, Lysimachus, Cassander, they each took their share, and in doing so, tore apart the fabric of what Alexander had created. The great machine of conquest had outlived its maker, but it no longer had a heart. Yet even as his empire dissolved, Alexander's shadow stretched farther than his armies ever had. Greek became the language of kings and scholars from Egypt to India. Cities bearing his name flourished as centers of trade, learning, and art. The very world he had conquered began to merge, shaping a new age, the Hellenistic world, where East met West not in battle, but in culture, philosophy, and science. In Alexandria, the city that bore his name, a great library would one day rise, a place meant to hold all the knowledge of mankind. In its halls, Greek thinkers and Egyptian priests debated the cosmos. Persian astronomers charted the stars, and Indian scholars shared ideas of medicine and mathematics. This was Alexander's true conquest, not of land, but of minds. But his legacy wasn't just carved in stone or written on scrolls, lived in the imaginations of those who came after. Julius Caesar, standing at his tomb centuries later, is said to have wept. "Do you not think," he whispered, "that I have reason to grieve, when Alexander was master of so many worlds, and I have yet to conquer one?" Napoleon carried his stories with him across Europe, studying his strategies, imitating his boldness. Generals, kings, poets all found themselves haunted by the ghost of a man who had refused to accept limits. What made Alexander unstoppable wasn't just his tactics or his armies, it was his mind. He understood something that few ever do, that fear, once conquered, becomes power. His soldiers feared no enemy because their king feared no fate. They followed him through deserts, storms, and death itself because he never asked them to go where he wouldn't. He led from the front, bled beside them, shared their hunger and their pain. He was mortal, yet he lived like he wasn't tanned. That belief made others see him as divine. But there's another side to his legacy, one that history often whispers instead of shouts. For every city he built, there was another burned. For every victory, thousands died. The unity he dreamed of came at a terrible cost. He changed the world, but the world never got to see what he might have built if he'd lived long enough to rule it. Still, even in tragedy, there's something eternal about him. Alexander reminds us of the double edge of human ambition, the light and the shadow. He showed how greatness can elevate humanity, and how it can destroy the man who carries it. And maybe that's why his story still endures. Because beneath the armor and glory, Alexander's story is not just about conquest. It's about the relentless hunger to know what lies beyond. He wasn't chasing power for its own sake. He was chasing the horizon, chasing meaning, chasing immortality. Today, over 2,000 years later, his name still echoes in classrooms, in strategy manuals, in legends told by firelight. His tactics are studied in military academies. His philosophy of leadership, courage, and destiny continues to inspire. And somewhere in that echo, you can almost hear the tramp of his soldiers' feet, the clash of sarissas, the cry of men who believed they were marching toward eternity, standing on the ruins of ancient empires. You can still trace his path, the roads that connect Europe and Asia, the cultural threads that link languages, art, and science. The world we live in was, in many ways, born from the ripples of his ambition. But the greatest question Alexander left behind isn't how he conquered the world, it's why. Was it pride? Was it destiny? Or was it the simple, terrifying truth that some souls are born unable to stand still? History remembers him as Alexander the Great, But perhaps the truer name is Alexander the Relentless, the man who refused to stop, even when the world lay beneath his feet. And maybe that's why his story will never die. Because deep inside every person, there's a spark that wonders what might happen if we too dared to step beyond the limits set for us. If we too burned our ships and never looked back. The horizon he chased is still out there, somewhere beyond our reach, waiting for another dreamer, braver, reckless enough to follow. So the next time you hear his name, don't just think of battles or empires. Think of what it means to strive for something greater than life itself. Because Alexander didn't just conquer the world. He showed humanity how far we can go when we refuse to be stopped. And that is the legacy of the unstoppable.